You know that moment when you're trying to open something, maybe a paint can or a really stubborn jar,
Yeah, definitely.
and you instinctively reach for some kind of tool, like a screwdriver, maybe a butter knife, or you use the edge of a counter for leverage.
Uh-huh.
We might not really think of these as, amazing inventions in that moment,
Right.
but fundamentally, they are machines. They're machines at work.
Absolutely, yeah. Forget those big complex contraptions for a second.
Okay.
At its heart, what we're diving into today is, well, the simple idea that a machine is basically any device that lets us get a job done with less effort than we'd need otherwise.
Less effort.
Think smarter, not harder, kind of.
Okay, let's unpack that less effort bit.
Yeah.
Our sources give this classic example.
A ramp.
Yeah, the ramp. Imagine hauling a heavy box straight up onto a platform
Hard work.
versus just pushing it up a ramp.
Yeah.
Now, the total amount of work done getting the box up there, it's the same.
Right.
But the ramp, that inclined plane,
Yeah.
it lets us use a smaller force just over a longer distance.
Less strain, less grunting involved,
Yeah,
hopefully.
exactly. And so over this deep dive, we're going to explore these foundational tools that make this effort reduction possible.
Yeah, we'll be looking at the 6 core types of simple machines that the material identifies. You've got the lever, the inclined plane, the wedge, the screw, the wheel and axle, and the pulley.
So our goal isn't just to define them.
No.
We want to really get how they work, spot them all around us.
See them in action.
Yeah, and appreciate how these really basic principles underpin so much of our modern world, making everything easier, faster, and, let's be honest, a lot less backbreaking.
Definitely. But before we jump into the specifics of each of these clever tools,
Yeah.
it's probably worth quickly touching on work and energy.
Good idea. Our sources lay those out.
Yeah.
So energy is basically the ability to do work, right? To make things happen.
Yep, that's the gist.
Now, the key thing about these simple machines is that they don't just magically create energy out of nowhere.
No, they wish. They're more like smart intermediaries.
Okay.
So a simple machine only helps us do work when we apply a force to it, when we put our energy into the system first.
Right. The sources really emphasize that. A machine only helps after we put in that initial effort.
Precisely.
Which brings us to this fundamental idea, often called the basic law of machines.
Mm-hmm.
It basically says that in a perfect world, the amount of work we get out of a machine equals the work we put in.
A nice, neat one-to-one exchange. Ideally.
Ideally. But as our sources point out, and as we kind of know from experience,
Real world isn't ideal.
exactly, the output is almost always a bit less than the input.
And the culprit usually is friction, that resistance you get when parts rub together.
Ah, friction. Always stealing a bit of our effort, right?
Yep. So some of the energy we put in just goes into overcoming that internal stickiness, basically.
Meaning we don't quite get the full potential work out the other end?
Correct. However, and this is the crucial bit, even with that energy loss, the main benefit is still huge. We can move or lift much bigger loads by applying a smaller force, less effort, onto the machine itself.
It makes the impossible possible, or at least much easier.
That's the core value, yeah.
Yeah.
Transforms the task.
Okay, let's get down to brass tacks then, starting with what's often called the simplest machine, the lever.
A lever, yes.
What exactly is a lever?
Well, at its most basic, it's just a stiff bar or rod that can pivot around a fixed point.
A pivot point.
Right. The sources call this the fulcrum. Then you've got the load, that's the thing you're trying to move, the resistance,
Okay,
and the effort, that's the force you apply to the lever.
got it. A bar, a pivot, something to move, and where we push or pull. How does this simple setup actually, boost our effort?
It's all about the distances. The magic is in the distance from where you push the effort to the fulcrum. That's the effort arm.
Okay.
And the distance from the load to the fulcrum, that's the load arm.
Effort arm, load arm.
Yeah. And the key principle, according to the sources, is load times load arm equals effort times effort arm.
Ah, so it's like a balancing act. Leverage.
Exactly. And from that, we get this idea of mechanical advantage, or MA.
MA, okay.
Our sources say MA is just the ratio of the load you can move to the effort you apply.
Load divided by effort.
Right. And that ratio is also equal to the effort arm divided by the load arm.
Effort arm over load arm. So if the effort arm is longer.
Bingo. If your effort arm is longer than the load arm, your MA is greater than 1.
Meaning
you need less effort to move that heavier load. That's the force gain right there.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the sources break levers down into 3 classes, right? based on where everything is positioned.
That's right. Fulcrum, load, effort, their arrangement defines the class.
Let's kick off with Class I levers then. What's the setup there?
Class 1. The fulcrum is right in the middle, between the load and the effort.
Fulcrum in the middle.
Yep. Think of a classic seesaw. The pivot's in the center, right?
Yeah.
One person is the load, the other provides the effort, and it can switch.
Okay, yeah, I can picture that perfectly. What are some other common examples? Things we use every day.
Let's see. The sources mention a beam balance, like for weighing things.
Okay.
A pair of pliers, the pivots between the jaws and the handles. Scissors, too. The screw is the fulcrum.
Right.
Oh, and a claw hammer when you're pulling out a nail.
Yeah.
The hammerhead rests on the wood. That's the fulcrum.
What nails the load?
You pull on their handle. That's the effort. Fulcrum between load and effort.
And didn't the sources mention our opening example, the spoon?
They did. Using a spoon to pry open a can lid. The edge of the can is the fulcrum.
Oh.
The stubborn lid is the load.
And your hand pressing down is the effort. Classic, Class 1.
Yep. Fulcrum in the middle.
Okay, it clicks now. Right, what about Class 2 levers? What's the defining difference?
Class 2. This time, the load is in the middle, between the fulcrum and the effort.
Load in the middle.
Yeah. Picture a nutcracker. The hinge at the end is the fulcrum.
Okay.
The nut you put inside is the load, right there in the middle. And your hand squeezing the handles at the other end provides the effort. Load between fulcrum and effort.
Load in the middle. Got it. What other familiar examples did the sources give for Class 2?
A bottle opener, another one we mentioned.
Right.
The bit that hooks under the cap edge, that's the fulcrum. The cap itself is the load you're lifting in the middle.
And your hand pulling up on the handle is the effort.
Exactly. Also, a wheelbarrow. The wheel's the fulcrum at the front.
Okay.
The stuff inside is the load, sitting between the wheel and you.
And you lifting the handles is the effort.
Yep. And even a mango cutter, apparently. You can visualize the pivot, the fruit, and where you push down.
Huh. Mango cutter. Okay. 2 down, 1 to go.
Class 3 levers.
Class 3. Now the effort is applied between the fulcrum and the load.
Effort in the middle this time.
That's it. Think about using forceps or maybe sugar tongs.
Okay.
The hinge, or the joined end, is the fulcrum. The object you're grabbing at the tips is the load.
And your hand squeezing in the middle, that's where the effort is applied. Effort between fulcrum and load.
Effort in the middle. Makes sense. Any other relatable Class 3 examples?
Yeah. The sources list fighter tongs. Same idea. A knife sometimes.
A knife? How?
Well, think about slicing. Often the point where the blade meets the handle can act like a pivot. The food is the load further down the blade, and your hand applies force in between.
Interesting way to think about it.
And maybe the coolest example, the human forearm.
Our own arm.
Yeah. Your elbow joint is the fulcrum. Your biceps muscle attaches to the forearm bone, kind of in the middle.
Okay.
That provides the upward effort. And whatever you're holding in your hand, that's the load at the end.
Wow. So my arm lifting this cup of coffee is a Class 3 lever.
Pretty much. That's a really direct personal example, isn't it? A simple machine right there in your body.
Never thought of it quite like that. That's a great perspective. Okay, moving on from levers. Next up, the inclined plane.
Ah, yes, the slope.
Now this one, as the material itself kind of flags, might not immediately scream machine.
That's true. It doesn't look like a typical gadget. An inclined plane is just a flat surface tilted at an angle, basically a ramp.
Right.
It helps us move heavy things upwards with less direct lifting force.
The classic example the sources use is pushing barrels or heavy boxes up a ramp onto a truck, right?
Exactly. Instead of trying to deadlift them straight up.
Yeah, you trade distance for force. You have to push it further along the slope. But the force you need at any moment is way less than lifting the full weight against gravity.
Precisely. And the sources give loads of everyday examples we might overlook.
Like what?
Well, stairs. A staircase is basically just an inclined plane letting us walk up between floors easily.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Roads winding up hills, highway flyovers, or overpasses.
Yeah.
Those are all inclined planes designed to reduce the steepness, make it easier to go up.
And I remember the sources mentioning those long, winding mountain roads.
Yeah, that's a perfect large-scale example. Makes the climb manageable for vehicles, even though the route is much longer than going straight up, which would be impossible.
Right. Less effort over more distance.
And importantly, they also highlighted wheelchair ramps.
Ah, yes. Accessibility.
Clearly shows how inclined planes make places usable for everyone by drastically reducing the effort needed.
Okay, next in our lineup, the pulley. These always seem pretty ingenious to me.
They are clever.
What's the basic idea behind how a pulley works?
A pulley is essentially a wheel with a groove around the edge. A rope or a cable sits in that groove.
Okay.
And its main job often is just to change the direction of the force you apply. Makes it more convenient.
Like the classic image of drawing water from a well.
Exactly that. You pull down on the rope.
And the bucket goes up. Much easier than leaning over and hauling it up directly.
Right. That change in direction is often the key benefit. Now, the sources talk about a single fixed pulley first.
Fixed, meaning?
Meaning its axle, the pin it spins on, is attached to something stationary, like a beam or a flagpole top.
Okay.
Now, it's great for changing direction, pull down, lift up, but the sources point out it doesn't actually reduce the amount of effort needed.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Ignoring friction for a moment, you still have to pull with a force equal to the weight you're lifting.
So convenience, but no real muscle saving there.
Pretty much. Examples given are, lifting water from a well, hoisting a flag.
Ah, the flagpole one.
Or sometimes on construction sites, workers might just sling a rope over a fixed point to lift materials.
Okay. So what about a single movable pulley? How's that different?
Right. With a movable pulley, the wheel is actually attached to the load.
Attached to the thing you're lifting.
Yeah. The rope goes through it, one end is fixed upwards, and you pull on the other end.
Okay. What's the advantage there?
Well, the sources touch on this briefly, but basically, the load is now supported by two sections of the rope pulling upwards.
Ah, so the weight is shared.
Effectively, yes. Each section of the rope only carries about half the load's tension, which suggests you only need about half the effort to lift it.
Got it. So that's where we start getting a real reduction in effort.
Mm-hmm.
And then the sources mention the block and tackle. That sounds like the heavy-duty version.
That's exactly what it is. A block and tackle system uses multiple pulleys together, some fixed, some movable, all working as a team.
Okay.
And as the sources say, the more segments of rope you have supporting the movable pulleys and the load,
The less force you need to pull.
precisely,
Yeah.
you get a bigger mechanical advantage. It lets you lift really heavy stuff with much less force.
Where would we typically see these?
Oh, places that need serious lifting power. Factories, farms, garages, maybe for engine hoists. Definitely construction sites for lifting beams and things.
Okay, more ropes supporting the load means less pulling force. Makes sense. Let's move on to the wheel and axle. This seems pretty fundamental.
Oh, it really is.
Yeah.
A wheel and axles is just that. A wheel attached to a central rod, the axle. They rotate together. And the sources emphasize, just the basic wheel itself is crucial for minimizing friction. Rolling is way easier than sliding.
True. So how does the combination work as a simple machine for gaining force?
Well, usually you apply your effort to the larger wheel part.
Okay.
And the load, or the resistance, is connected to the smaller axle part.
So big wheel, small axle.
Yeah. And because the wheel has a much bigger radius or diameter than the axle, a small force applied way out on the edge of the wheel creates a much larger turning force right at the surface of the smaller axle.
Can you give us a clear example from the sources? Make it concrete.
The screwdriver is perfect. Think about it. The handle is the large wheel.
Okay.
The metal shaft that actually turns the screw is the smaller axle.
Right.
When you twist that big handle, even gently.
It puts a lot more twisting force onto the screw itself.
Exactly. Way more force than if you just tried to pinch and turn the tiny screw head with your fingers.
That's a great visual. What other common wheel and axle setups do the sources mention?
Let's see. A car's steering wheel. Small turn of the big wheel makes the steering column, the axle, turn with more force.
Okay.
Bicycle pedals turning the crank axle.
Doorknobs.
Yeah. You turn the larger knob, the wheel, to rotate a smaller spindle, the axle, inside, which moves the latch.
Ah, I never thought of it that way.
And even a simple water tap or faucet. The handle is the wheel, turning the smaller valve stem, the axle, inside.
Wow, they really are everywhere when you start looking. Okay, next up, the screw.
The screw.
At first glance, it seems maybe like just a fancy nail. But it's more complex, right? It's a machine.
Absolutely. As our sources describe it, a screw is basically just an inclined plane.
A ramp.
Wrapped around a cylinder or rod.
Yeah.
The spiral ridges, the threads. That's the inclined plane part.
Okay. And it has a tip and a head.
Yeah, usually a pointed tip to get it started, and a head designed to be turned by a tool, like a screwdriver.
So how does that spiraling ramp give us an advantage compared to just hammering a nail straight in?
Well, think about the path. As you rotate the screw, it follows those threads, right?
Uh-huh.
It travels a much longer distance into the material for each rotation than a nail does going straight down.
Right, it's winding its way in.
And because it's traveling a longer distance for the same depth, You can achieve that depth with a smaller turning force.
Ah, distance versus force again.
Exactly. Plus, the sources mention, those threads give it a much, much firmer grip in the material because they bite in. Way more holding power than a smooth nail.
That makes total sense. Spiral path, better grip. The sources also mention a screw jack. How does that work?
Yeah, a screw jack uses that exact same principle. You turn a handle, which rotates a large screw thread.
Okay.
And this rotation causes the jack to slowly extend upwards with a huge amount of force. It converts your small rotational effort into a massive linear lifting force.
Allowing you to lift something really heavy like a car.
Precisely.
Yeah.
For changing a tire or maintenance.
Okay, nearly there. Last one on our list of simple machines, the wedge.
The wedge.
This sounds like it's all about splitting things or pushing them apart.
That's his main job, yeah. A wedge, as the sources define it, is basically two inclined planes joined back to back to form a sharp edge.
Two ramps meeting at a point?
Kind of, yeah. It's designed so that when you force it into something, it pushes outwards, sideways.
So how does that double ramp shape help amplify force when you're, say, chopping wood with an axe? An axe is a wedge, right?
Exactly. An axe head is a classic wedge. When you swing it and hit the wood, the force you apply downwards is redirected outwards along those sloping sides.
Okay.
As the wedge goes deeper, those sides push the wood fibers apart, overcoming the forces holding them together and causing the split.
Right.
And the sources point out that thinner, sharper wedges generally need less force to drive in because the angle is gentler.
Less steep incline makes it easier.
Got it. What are some other common wedges we see around?
Well, knives, obviously, axe heads. A plow uses a wedge shape to break up soil.
Okay.
But also, think about the tip of a nail that's a small wedge getting it started.
The teeth on a saw blade are essentially a row of tiny wedges. A sewing beetle parts the fabric with its wedge point.
Wow.
Even the front of a speedboat, the bow, is often wedge shapes to cut through the water more easily.
So it takes force in one direction and splits it outwards. Fascinating. Okay, so we've covered the 6 simple machines. Now, the sources also talk about efficiency. We touched on friction earlier.
Mm-hmm. The energy thief.
Let's look at efficiency a bit more formally.
Right. So, as we said, no real machine is perfect. Some energy always gets lost, mainly to friction.
Okay.
Efficiency, as the sources define it, is basically a ratio. It's the useful work you get out of the machine divided by the total work you put into the machine.
Output work over input work.
Exactly. And it's usually given as a percentage.
So the example was like an 80% efficient machine.
Yeah. That means 80% of the energy you put in actually does the job you want it to do.
Then the other 20%.
That's lost. Mostly turns into heat because of friction between the moving parts. Right. Wasted energy, essentially.
Right. And a 100% efficient machine would be the ideal.
Perfect machine, yeah. But the sources are clear. Because friction is always there in the real world, you never actually achieve 100% efficiency.
Always some loss. Okay. Finally, the sources wrap up by talking about looking after our machines, care and maintenance.
Yeah, which is important. They point out how vital these tools, simple and complex, are for, well, everything, the economy, our daily lives.
So what are the key things we need to do to keep them working well?
They highlighted 3 main things. First, protect them from rust.
Rust, the enemy.
Yeah, so using paint or some kind of protective coating is really important for longevity. Stops them corroding.
Okay, makes sense.
Second, lubrication. Regular oiling or greasing of moving parts.
Why is that so crucial?
Oh, it cuts down on friction. Less friction means higher efficiency.
Right, less wasted energy.
Less wear and tear on the parts so they last longer. And often, less noise, too. Quieter operation.
Good points. What was the third thing?
Just keeping them covered when they're not being used.
Covering them up.
Yeah. Protects them from dust, dirt, moisture, all that stuff that can gum up the works or cause damage over time.
Seems like basic common sense, really.
It is, but it's easy to forget. These simple steps make a big difference in keeping machines functional and extending their lifespan.
Absolutely. Proper care just ensures these tools, whether it's a simple lever or, a complex engine part, keep doing their job, making life easier.
Couldn't agree more.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it really is quite remarkable, isn't it, to just step back and see how deeply ingrained these 6 simple machines are. Everywhere.
Yeah, they're the absolute fundamentals, the building blocks that let us do things that would be incredibly hard, maybe impossible, just using our own muscle power.
Totally.
And what's really cool is how these basic ideas, some figured out thousands of years ago, they form the basis of all the super complex technology we have today. Even the most advanced machines are often just, Clever combinations of these fundamental levers, planes, pulleys, wheels, screws, and wedges.
It really makes you think. Maybe now, as you, the listener, go about your day after hearing this, you'll start seeing things differently. Can you spot the simple machines in just, I don't know, a pair of scissors, or a bike, or even a can opener?
And recognize how these basic things are constantly, quietly making your life easier.
Exactly. And maybe it sparks other questions too.
Like how engineers are always fighting against that friction we talked about, trying to make things more efficient.
Yeah. Or maybe digging into the history. Thinking about people like Archimedes and his work on levers.
There's so much there, a whole world of mechanics and innovation all built on these beautifully simple, elegant principles. Really makes you appreciate the basics.